Morning and welcome to our continuing Bible reflections from John's Gospel. This morning we're going to spend a little time exploring one of the events of the first Easter morning when Mary Magdalene encountered the risen Lord in the garden. The reading is taken from John chapter 20, beginning at verse 11. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I do not know where they have put him." At this she turned and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me, where have you put him, and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned to him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them the things that he had said to her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We know that this reading is set on the third day after the crucifixion, a time of utter turmoil. They'd watched Jesus die a slow, agonizing death on the cross. As he died, he'd been accompanied by those to whom he was closest. They'd placed him in a borrowed tomb. Imagine, if you can, their sadness, their desolation, the hopelessness of those who'd shared the amazing days of his ministry. They'd learned firsthand all that he had to teach them of God's love and God's will for the world. They'd known the excitement of Jesus' growing ministry as he fed the thousands, healed the sick. Now he was gone. They must have felt, so many emotions, confusion, utterly bereft, left without a leader and helpless in the face of the cruel death that he'd suffered. So on that third day, Mary Magdalene went early to the tomb where they'd laid him. Perhaps she just felt the need to be physically close to his body, as if that in itself might help to heal the hurt she felt inside. But the tomb was empty. Jesus wasn't there, just folded grave clothes and two angels. Can you imagine how she felt? Can you imagine the added sense of loss that even the body wasn't safe in the borrowed tomb? She'd hurried off to tell the others, and they'd checked, but they couldn't find a sign of Jesus either. So Mary had been left alone. Mary had returned to that empty tomb where the angels had spoken to her to tell her that the Lord was risen. And when she turned around, there he stood. And it had taken a little while for it to dawn on her that this was indeed the Lord. What a moment in time. We can only begin to imagine the emotions. She must have been confused, delighted, overwhelmed. I would think the thoughts were tumbling over themselves, as were her words, as she tried to marshal some kind of speech to respond to him. It interests me that Jesus chose to appear to Mary Magdalene, a woman who'd been rejected, abused, used, disregarded, who was seen as not being worth time and attention. And yet the Lord loved her, noticed her, drew her close, spent time with her. And in the Lord she had found acceptance, forgiveness, wholeness, and hope for the future. I think the story of Mary teaches us all an awful lot, that however broken we might find ourselves, however unworthy we might think ourselves, Jesus has a place for us, a hope for us, a promise for us. I could go on revisiting the things of that first day. I could rehash things that no doubt we've all heard in church many, many times, every Easter for as long as we've been Christians. But I'd like instead to invite us all to try and imagine ourselves into the place of Mary on that first Easter Sunday, to imagine ourselves standing beside the empty tomb, to imagine ourselves meeting the risen Lord face to face. How would we have responded? Would we have recognised him for who he was? Would we have had the courage to greet him by name? Would we have found hope in that situation? Would we have known that even in the darkest times, the Lord would come to reassure us and point us to a brighter future? I'd like to offer you a reflection from Mary's point of view. This was a time like no other that I have known. For this man, this Jesus, was so very different from anyone I'd ever met. He alone accepted me just as I was. In him I'd found such love, such acceptance, total forgiveness. And little by little, Jesus' love had unpicked the damage of years of being used and despised by others. Little by little, this Jesus gave me hope, acceptance, self-respect. But then the unthinkable happened. The life of Jesus, so vital, so full of love and hope, was snuffed out. There on the cross, we watched his life ebb away through hours of unspeakable agony and mocking. And yet, even then, despite the pain, despite the suffering and injustice, my Lord spoke words of love and hope and forgiveness to others. And so we watched silently. No words could express the sense of aching loss so deep inside. Lost love, lost hope, a lost future. Then followed the darkest of nights, nights of grief and unbelief, of mourning and longing, of hope and despair. Until finally, on that third day, as dawn broke, I could sit no longer. The need to be in the garden, simply to be near his body, was so intense. And so as the first streaks of light crossed the sky, I approached the tomb and the stone was rolled away. But how could this be? Who could have done such a thing? Did the authorities fear him so much that even in death they could not let him rest in peace? In dread and longing, I approached the tomb to find his body gone. All that remained, the empty grave clothes. My mind was filled with such confusion. For what was left? What hope? What purpose in my life? As I stumbled forward, vision blurred with tears, I became aware of a figure up ahead. Perhaps this man would know. Perhaps he was the gardener. He could tell me where they've taken Jesus' body, and I can find him and care for him again. Endless questions pounding through my brain. And then the voice I knew so well, so tender, so very, very familiar. A voice I knew so well, and yet hardly dared believe. Mary? Gently he called my name. Mary! And then I knew. Somehow he was here. Somehow Jesus was alive. His body not stolen. He was risen. My Lord was risen. Even the tomb cannot contain this amazing man. And my heart sang. Hope is not gone and love cannot be denied. Still, I do not know just what the future will hold, but this I know and this I treasure in my heart. My Lord lives. Jesus is here and he will never leave me alone. And in his life, in his triumph over death, my life and my destiny